nothing. So we had about, I was going to check how many, I think.
It was over 50, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I was thinking it might have been more like 70, but I don't remember for sure.
Wonderful.
But it was 50 a day or so ago, and it's been rising.
Yeah, and we sent out another alert a couple hours ago, so.
That's right, that's right.
Well, that's nice you're recording it. I was going to suggest that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, it's supposed to record automatically, and it looks like it is.
Yeah, it says so up in the
Mm-hmm.
top left-hand corner, so.
Actually, maybe we should wait. Okay, I think that worked. Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Cole Harrison with Massachusetts Peace Action, and we welcome you to the first of our webinar series on Stop the Coronavirus Sanctions. We're going to deal with 4 countries in turn, and tonight we're dealing with Iran and calling to stop the sanctions on Iran in the age of coronavirus. Mass Peace Action is a state peace organization. We're part of the National Peace Action Network. We work to abolish nuclear weapons. We try to end U.S. wars and occupations and sanctions, and we try to cut the military budget to fund things that really keep us safe, like healthcare, for example. And we're joined tonight by Lift the Sanctions Mass, which is a new coalition of 9 or 10 groups that are joined together to push this issue, including sponsoring these webinars and also pressuring Congress. I'll just quickly run through some of the co-sponsors. Massachusetts Bolivia Solidarity Committee of Western Mass, Resistance Center for Peace and Justice, the Latin America Solidarity Coalition of Western Mass, the Boston Democratic Socialists of America, the American Friends Service Committee, the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, the NIAC Action, or National Iranian American Council Action, the Peace and Social Justice Committee of Friends Meeting at Cambridge, and Code Pink Women for Peace. So thanks to them for sponsoring this webinar. We're going to be asking you to take action tonight on a sign-on letter. There's a sign-on letter in Congress calling on the administration to suspend sanctions on Iran during the time of coronavirus. And we're going to paste the link into the chat. We've had a call-in day this week already on that letter. 4 of our Massachusetts representatives have signed on to it, or I should say 2 senators and 2 representatives, Senator Markey and Warren, and Reps Presley and McGovern have signed on. The other 7 House reps have not yet signed on, as far as we know. And so those are the ones we need to reach. Our next webinars, a week from tonight, we'll be dealing with Venezuela and the impact of sanctions and its coronavirus response. The following week, on I guess April 9th, we'll deal with Cuba and how sanctions are impacting it, and also lifting up the positive things Cuba has been able to do about coronavirus. They've sent a plane load of doctors to Italy and what have you to help out, more than the U.S. has done, really. And then on the 16th, we'll be dealing with North Korea, its coronavirus impact, as well as the positives from South Korea's approach to coronavirus. So that's what we got lined up in the next 4 weeks. I'm going to introduce our 2 panelists. They'll each speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions, and Brian will be sort of pulling the questions together. So if you can send your questions over by clicking on the Q&A or the chat or email or however you can reach Brian, he'll kind of filter them and get them organized and present them. So with that, Shahin Tabatabaei is a urologic oncologist at Mass General Hospital, born in Tehran. And Shahin, take it away. And then I'll introduce Jama when it's his turn.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. You guys see my screen right now? Great.
Yes.
All, thanks, Cole, for the invitation. It is certainly very hard to talk about another nation's problem when we are all dealing with our own set of major issues with this pandemic. But one thing that I would say this pandemic has shown us is the fact that we are far more connected than we ever thought. Therefore, I believe it is actually very relevant to talk about the sufferings of another country of 80 million during this pandemic. I've been in the United States for the last 26 years, most of my adult life. Currently, I'm a surgeon at Mass General and assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. In the last year, my wife and I had to frequently travel to Tehran, Iran, mainly to provide some support and care to our aging parents who are struggling with some medical issues. I'm certainly not a political expert, neither I have any political agenda. My participation is mainly for humanitarian reasons. I'm just trying to share my firsthand experience regarding the impact of the US sanctions on ordinary people. So I thought it may make more sense to just give you some stories of my personal encounters, basically. And most of the stories are medical field. You're more than welcome to ask questions about other impacts on people's daily life. Things that we take for granted, like medical imaging, ultrasound, CT scan, MRI. Many years ago, some of them, like MRI, were considered like high-tech equipment, and there were just some questions about it. But right now, with these broad sanctions, basically most of these medical equipments are banned and people cannot use it. If they're using something and is broken or needs some spare parts, they cannot possibly get that spare parts. I have a friend had this significant issue with his abdomen, with basically prostate cancer, and had to get an MRI. And he had to go through 3 hospitals because hospitals were initially, the device was working, but like in the middle of the day, it was just broken or not working, and they didn't have spare parts to fix it. And that caused a significant delay in medical diagnosis. PET scan is a technology that we use for patients with cancer. It helps us to understand the spread of cancer and how cancers affect different areas of the body. And based on that, we make major decision making. If the patient needs surgery or needs chemotherapy or radiation therapy. One of my very close friends, a 55-year-old lady, had this intestinal cancer, and she really needed this PET scan. But the whole country of Iran, with 80 million, they only have one device. They cannot get more because of sanctions. She had to wait for 3 months to get her PET scan done, and that caused significant delay in her treatment. One of my medical professors from medical school had a hip fracture in one of these trips, and I was actually personally involved because of the relationship I had over the last 30 years with him. And it's a very common problem, as you know, when we get older. And the treatment is usually just using this hip prosthesis. It's a small device. It's really not very sophisticated, but it requires like a medical manufacturer, a reputable one, to produce one. And they have to size it and everything. So he had to literally go to black market, buy his own prosthesis to get it because it was not available. And ultimately, he could not find the right size for himself. And after so many months, he's wheelchair bound. He never had that operation done. One of my friends is a surgeon, one of the very famous hospitals over there. And he tells me that surgical staples that are basically one of the very basic equipments of surgery, they are banned and they can't get it. They get some low quality ones from other countries that are mostly like counterfeits of the original ones, so they can't use it. And because of that, patients are suffering because the operation is going to be longer, morbidity of the operation is more, and complications and recovery is definitely more. This is something that is hard to believe. You know, patients, sometimes elderly, have difficulty emptying their bladder. We place this FOLEY catheter, special catheter in their bladder. And some of them have to live with this catheter. But again, this is in sanctions. It's sometimes very hard to understand, really that rationale, but they are part of the sanctions, the broad sanctions. And one of my friend's father, that because I'm a urologist, I was personally involved with his care. He couldn't get a high quality one, so we got very poorly made, manufactured one. And he had to try so many times, and because of that, he got so many infections. Ultimately, because of recurrent hospitalizations and infections, he died of sepsis, something that's completely avoidable. Same goes on with medications. Medications for common medical issues, hypertension, diabetes. Like for diabetes, these sensors that you can check your blood sugar, it's hard to find. Chemotherapy agents for cancer, mental health issues, medications for mental health, they're all actually in significant shortage. So I was really trying to figure out what's going on with this, because as you know, technically, there's no direct sanctions on healthcare related services. So, and every time we hear it, there's always stress on this fact that there's no direct sanctions. But the problem is indirect, but it's vast. The problem is to buy a medical equipment, to buy a medication, you need to basically go to the bank and pay for it. And then you need to deliver it to the destination, and you're hoping to get a tech support. Now, because of these other sanctions, all financial transactions with Iran is completely banned. There's no transportation. Basically, it's almost impossible to deliver even a package to Iran, because airplanes and even shipping industry, they're all banned. And then because of travel ban, you can't have any technical support locally in that country. And because of all these many companies, they cannot provide care and services over there. And they're really worried about their businesses in other areas. And they're worried that if they have any mistakes in this very complex path, they may get into trouble with the United States government, and they don't want to risk it. And that's why they completely avoid any transaction with Iran. So how were things before all these sanctions? Was everything perfect? Absolutely not. Things were not perfect, but although it was overwhelming, it was functional. People still could get their medications with some delay. They could get their operations done. And as you've heard, probably medical care and medical system in Iran is actually pretty advanced for a third world country. How are things now under the sanctions? Well, I would say under the sanctions, things are unsustainable. Now, make no mistake, I'm not suggesting the political system is unsustainable. That's none of my business. I don't have any expertise on that. But just the high demand and lack of adequate supply in healthcare, definitely many more people are going to die unnecessarily. Now, the combination of sanctions and coronavirus, that caused a situation that was unsustainable, unbearable. And now you may not, with this coronavirus, many of my medical friends, they explain this high toll that the virus is taking from people as they lack some very basic medical equipments. I'm sure by now you heard all about this PPE, the protection tools that physicians have to use and nurses have to use. They're lacking that. Disinfectants are part of sanctions. They can't get it directly. Medical imaging. Many of these patients that have respiratory issue, CT scan is the first modality, actually helps with the diagnosis, with early diagnosis. There's not enough CT scan machines because of sanctions. And the ones that are working, they're falling apart because they're over using them. And they go out of commission again, because of sanctions. Now, on top of everything, truly, literally, when it rains, it pours. It happens to them because now they have this flooding, like widespread flood in Iran, on top of coronavirus, on top of sanctions, and situation for people that was unsustainable, unbearable. Now it's dire, and it's really, really sad. So I'm concluding my my part by just asking the other panel expert. I really want to know really what's the efficiency of this sanction? What's the effectiveness? Is there any history behind it? Does sanction truly change countries' behavior and political will? And the second thing is the human cost of sanctions really justified? Let's say it delivers result, but is it justified, the human cost that it has caused? I added this video clip to this part, but I don't know, Cole, if you can see it very well, I'll stop it. But it's a very, to me, was very interesting because you see these selfless, faceless people, medical personnel that are trying to just light up their patient spirit. Thank you, Cole.
Okay, thanks, Shahin. That was terrific. And sorry we had this, the thing kept reverting back to my screen. I wasn't aware of what was happening. We're picking this up as we go along and learning how to do this webinar correctly. But that was a really inspiring video and heart-wrenching stories of your medical colleagues. Now I want to turn to Jamal Abdi. He is Executive Director of NIAC Action. NIAC is the National Iranian American Council. It's a grassroots civic action organization devoted to advancing peace and championing the priorities of the Iranian American community. And longtime MAPA members will remember that he addressed MAPA's annual meeting. I forget how many years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, and that was a great day. Jamal, take it away.
Well, thank you to Cole and Mass Peace Action for putting this together. I hope everybody watching is safe and staying sane in these extreme circumstances. I'm coming to you from my home office / toddler playroom. And I really appreciate Shahin's presentation, because the fact of the matter is that, you know, these sanctions have been impacting humanitarian trade and the daily lives of Iranians, you know, since they were put in place. And we have to remember that these sanctions were put back in place because the Trump administration, because Donald Trump didn't like Obama's deal, thought he could get a better deal. and snap sanctions back on after they had been lifted in 2016 as a result of the nuclear deal. Iran was complying, but Trump surrounded himself with ideologues and fueled by his own personal animus towards President Obama. He exited the deal, snapped these sanctions back into place, and this moment where Iranians, after years of sanctions, years of global ostracism, finally thought that they were going to be on a different pathway. And if you remember in 2015, when the nuclear deal was finalized, Iranians poured out into the streets. They were celebrating. The people were playing music in their cars and dancing in the streets, and it was supposed to be this new beginning. And you fast forward just 4.5 years from that point, and it's almost unimaginable how tragic things have become. The coronavirus has taken the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure on Iran and put it on steroids, made it the equivalent of a nuclear bomb. Obviously not really, but metaphorically. The aim of this policy was to punish ordinary Iranians. So the aim of the Trump administration's policy on Iran is to impose so much suffering on ordinary people that they decide to rise up in the streets and either force the government to change its policies or collapse the government or collapse the state. I think that it was more likely the latter. The Trump administration always claimed it did not seek regime change, but the demands that were issued upon which sanctions relief was made contingent were essentially asking Iran to completely change its entire security infrastructure and to do things that nobody in their right mind expects Iran is going to do, at least not at the with a gun pointed at their head, and not based on chest thumping from Washington in one iteration. The approach towards Iran had always been one in which, we saw how negotiations actually produced something, and that nuclear deal was supposed to be an opening for more negotiations to actually address some of the legitimate concerns the United States has. But as Mr. Pompeo has said, maximum pressure is working because Iranians' lives are so terrible and so miserable, and we have had 2 instances of major protests in Iran. Largely as a result of economic woes and sanctions, but also because of legitimate grievances with the government. Now, what we're looking at today is a call to action that I had hoped, and I think many of us hoped, could transcend the ideological politics and tit for tat that we normally are dealing with when it comes to just about any policy nowadays, but especially Iran policy. And unfortunately, we're still in a situation where our government, where President Trump and others that support him and surround him are still seemingly in denial about what is happening today with coronavirus, not just in Iran or around the world, but in the United States. And when you have a government that is now openly talking about potentially letting 2% of Americans die as a cost for saving the economy, it just does not inspire a lot of hope in me that they're going to do the right thing when it comes to ensuring that the U.S. is not killing Iranians. The worst case estimates right now are that 3.5 million Iranians are going to die of coronavirus unless something is done, and done quickly. And instead of reacting to that and treating this as an opportunity to suspend the sanctions, as we and other groups have called for, and which a number of members of Congress are now calling for, the Trump administration has added new sanctions since the coronavirus has begun to spread in Iran. They just issued new designations today. So the appeals to, the pushback has been, people say, well, you guys are always against sanctions. Anything that happens, you're against sanctions. So this is illegitimate. And my reaction is just, yes, we have opposed sanctions because they are inhumane, because broad sanctions are just that. They're broad. They cannot be narrowly targeted to only impact officials in the Iranian government, to impact their cost-benefit analysis. Broad sanctions are a form of collective punishment. The theory behind them is you impose enough collective punishment that then you put pressure through ordinary people, you put pressure on the government. And so, yeah, we've opposed sanctions for that reason. We've opposed these sanctions because they're not tied to any achievable goal. It's unclear, and Shahin mentioned, the history of sanctions. No sanctions regime has actually delivered what it aimed to do when it was not clearly targeted and tied to clear deliverables on the part of the sanctioned party. So if there's no clear, okay, you do this, you get the sanctions lifted, sanctions have never worked. And broad sanctions, if you want to know the record for broad sanctions, just look at Iran today, North Korea, Cuba, and Iraq. That's the model that we have in place for Iran. I think the one case where people highlight that sanctions worked was in the case of divestment from South Africa. And we have to remember that was part of a movement. That was part of a movement led by South Africans asking the world to divest because it was part of their strategy. In Iran, we don't have Iranians calling for more sanctions as part of a civil society strategy. Civil society has been decimated as a result of Trump pulling out of this nuclear deal, giving hardliners in Iran far more political capital than they previously had, and completely dismantling the movement that had come out of the Green Movement in 2009, which elected the current president of Iran, and which was hopefully going to drive this new pathway for Iran. That is now not on the table. But the reason that we're advocating to lift sanctions today is that the humanitarian impact of these sanctions is now on steroids. It's now on such a scale greater than it had been before that we are hoping that those who at least acknowledge, yes, broad sanctions do hurt people, but it's worth the cost. Well, fine. Is it still worth the cost if we kill 3.5 million Iranians in the process? Others will say, well, the Iranian government has mishandled the response to coronavirus. And I think that's true. I think our government has mishandled the response to coronavirus as well. But the Iranian government did some egregious things trying to cover up the virus and trying to clamp down on whistleblowers and things like that. That's fine. I cannot control the policies of the Iranian government. I can, in theory, as a voter, as a citizen, as an active person, I can impact the decisions that are happening in the name of my government. And if my government is going to go and kill 3.5 million people, I have something to say about that. And I don't think that's an excuse for the US contributing to the spread of coronavirus in Iran and killing innocent people. If that is still not compelling for folks, I think that there needs to be a recognition that we are in this together. This is a global struggle. So if we do not do what it takes to ensure that we are not undermining Iran's response to this virus, if we don't do that and the virus continues to spread in Iran, that is going to encourage its spread worldwide. That's what we know about this virus. It's not going to be contained inside of Iran. This is not a targeted virus. This is a global virus. So it's also in our own narrow self-interest to ensure that this virus can be contained so that we can actually put this thing out as fast as possible. The other piece of this is that we're not just talking about sanctions. So the reason that we see these humanitarian issues is largely because humanitarian sales or humanitarian trade is exempt from sanctions. So technically, and a lot of the goods that Shahin outlined are not exempt and they need to be specially licensed, but there are a number of humanitarian goods that are exempt from the sanctions. But all of the banking channels to actually sell those goods to Iran are completely sanctioned. The ways that those are shipped to Iran are largely sanctioned. And so there are so many hurdles that even if you can get something, it's going to cost far more than it would otherwise. And for most Iranians, it's unaffordable. And for most of these medical centers, they can't afford them or they can't find them, they can't obtain them. So lifting the financial sanctions is really important. But the other piece of this is it's not just the sanctions impact on humanitarian goods and devices. we have to look at how this disease is impacting us here in the United States. We're passing, what, a $2 trillion stimulus bill? Think about if our country was under maximum pressure, if our economy had shrunk by over 10% last year, if people were already struggling to buy, on a large scale, struggling to buy certain types of food and medicine and things like that. And then you have this virus hit the country. This is now going to increase that level of destitution exponentially, and that hinders the ability to fight the virus because, as you'll see, the Iranian government actually did not call for quarantines, did not demand that people stay inside of their homes. And that is likely because if people stay in their homes and the economy shuts down, the government does not have the resources to actually support people. So in addition to this virus, you will start to see people start running out of money and no social safety net to be able to save them. So this is also about the broader economic impacts of these sanctions and the fact that that impact is causing the Iranian government to have to make decisions that, very much like Trump has framed the decision as, either we, undermine the economy or we let people die. And that is this decision he's having to juggle. In Iran, they're having to decide, can we even shut down the economy because we don't have the resources to actually support that. Now, they recently have announced some of those quarantines, and that may be tied to some of the humanitarian relief that is coming in from Europe. But the sanctions still remain this major issue that is just completely undermining the ability for Iran to deal with this virus. So what we are calling for, and I don't think that, well, let me just say this. It's not all doom and gloom as far as getting this policy change, because we've already seen the administration have to adjust. So in September of last year, the administration actually took an unprecedented step and actually began targeting humanitarian goods. So just as I said that humanitarian goods are not sanctioned, in September of last year, the administration actually slapped terrorism sanctions on Iran's central bank. And what this did was it eviscerated the humanitarian exemption. There's no exemption for an entity that's designated under terrorism. And so if the central bank is designated as a terrorist organization and touches every facet of Iran's economy, and dealing with foreign reserves and trade and all those things, no element of the economy is exempt from the sanctions. And so we pushed back on this. Others highlighted it. And in February, as the coronavirus situation was growing out of control, the Treasury, finally gave in and actually issued a exemption to no longer be sanctioning those humanitarian goods. And I think that the reason was that they saw what was happening with coronavirus spreading inside of Iran, and this was completely indefensible. They could no longer go out with their talking point of, well, humanitarian goods are technically exempt, because they no longer were. So now we're at least where we were before September. But what we need to do is increase the pressure, increase the global pressure. And if we can't get this government to react, we do need to get the rest of the world to also put pressure. And also, I think it could get to a situation where we would need to try to convince the international community to defy US sanctions, which the Europeans and others have, but private entities have not. Private businesses, when Trump left the nuclear deal, Europe actually passed laws saying you cannot comply with the sanctions that Trump just slapped on Iran. They're illegal and will punish you if you do. And even with that kind of pressure, European entities stopped investing in Iran. They completely cut ties. They completely backed away. And so those rules were unenforceable. With this new global pandemic and this new crisis, we may be in a situation where, whether it's because of greater government controls of some of these supply chains and things like that, or other reactions to the spread of the virus, if the US doesn't act, the rest of the world may have opportunities to act. So what we need to do is really put the pressure on now. We've got this letter in Congress that the deadline has been extended to next week. We need to get as many members of Congress on that letter. We need to raise awareness through that. And after that letter gets sent, we need to start looking at all the other opportunities to put pressure on this government for these inhumane crimes that they are essentially committing.
Thanks, Jamal. We had heard that that letter was closing tomorrow. Is it indeed extended to next week? Is that the latest?
Oh, I should double check because I had heard it was going to be extended to next week, but then I never
That's
got the
what we
official.
heard.
Yeah.
That's what we heard this morning, and then later this afternoon it came through that it would close end of business Friday. Anyway, I'll post in here. Post in 2 links in the chat. This is an action page where you can send a letter to Congress about all of this, including the letter. And this is the actual text of the letter, as well as some additional information. And then Miriam Sabaki has also pasted in another great action. It's called 80 Hours for 80 Million Lives, that is trying to call directly into the Treasury and put pressure on the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, to cut it out and to relax the sanctions. And they've got a great system where you sign up, and you sign up for like a 5-minute window or something, and they tell you exactly when to call the Treasury so that they're truly bombarded, and we and all the supporters spread ourselves over the time. So that's a great project. Let's open up for questions. Brian, do you have any questions for the panelists?
Yeah, actually, we have a lot of great questions. I want to encourage people to write their questions in the Q&A thread that's on the bottom of your screen, just to the left of center. But we have a lot of questions already, so sorry if we don't get to them all. And this first one is for you, Jamal. Are we able to, and this is from Mohsen Jalali, are we able to positively use this moment to have the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, bring up this issue on a national level more seriously? Mohsen says that they're concerned that it's one of the things that there's bipartisan agreement on is anti-Iran sentiment. They say that the only thing that is different between Democrats and Republicans are the methods, and remind us that Obama himself also imposed sanctions. So your comment, John.
The politics around Iran have pretty dramatically shifted here in Washington. Shifted pretty dramatically during the nuclear talks and then the congressional battle over securing the nuclear deal. You had both Republicans and people like Benjamin Netanyahu really taking unprecedented measures to attack the Democratic president. And for a lot of policymakers or elected policymakers, for whom foreign policy is, maybe not their specialty, but there is sort of a rule book you play by. And for a long time that was, saying things like, you don't talk about the occupied territories. It's the Jewish state of Israel. Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, and all these little cliches that are really sort of the tip of the iceberg for a policy that is aimed at, in this case, isolating Iran and continually being at odds with the country. The nuclear deal really did break that. And I think that the way that you'll see Democrats who don't know what they're talking about even, but talk about Iran is much different today than it was just a few years ago. That being said, it's still not positive, and it's still a complex issue. But there's a lot more traction now than there had been a few years ago. And we have to remember, we are in a situation now where in the 2020 elections, every single major Democratic candidate committed publicly to returning to the nuclear deal and ending the sanctions as a priority commitment, as a 100 days commitment. So, and I think people could say, well, are they really going to make good on that promise? We have to hold them accountable to it, but that is where the politics are. My concern is really just the massive gulf between where Democrats are and Republicans are, where if Democrats were in the White House, they would suspend these sanctions for humanitarian reasons, but also these sanctions wouldn't be in place because they would be in the nuclear deal again. I think this is a moment to, it's hard to think about things strategically where you're, gaming things out more than just a few weeks from now because there's so much uncertainty. But if we are going to view this situation in that lens, I do think this is an important moment for people to be educated about what we are doing around the world and how, these sanctions are sort of like, the diplomatic equivalent of drone strikes, where we are doing so much damage. We're hurting people. We are undermining our interests. We are changing the nature of the political dynamics inside of Iran such that we may not be able to have a diplomatic opportunity in the future. And all these things are happening outside of the view of the American public. And now we not only are seeing things, the humanitarian impacts exposed in Iran, but we're also living through this moment that, has to at least trigger some level of empathy among people who are seeing, our own stores have empty shelves. Now imagine what it's like inside of Iran and look at what we've done to Iran for all these times. So I think both through actions like this letter, where we're trying to use that as an organizing tool to get as many members of Congress educated on this and signed up for suspending sanctions, which a few years ago, unthinkable. But it's also, it's an opportunity to hopefully if there's some political change, to actually get something done in 2021 that's has a much bigger impact.
Thank you, Jamal. Before I go on to the next question, I do want to mention the person who I'm filling in for, Keo Kochi, for all of their great organizing around this webinar and the call-ins to Congress on this issue. Really couldn't have done it without them. Unfortunately, experiencing an illness in the family, so I'm filling in. Just wanted to send out my thoughts if they're watching this later. On to the next question. This one is for you, Dr. Tabatabaei. It's from Christian Kennedy. Are there any goods or services that could be boycotted, financial items that could be divested to put more pressure on the U.S. To relieve the sanctions? How do you feel about that kind of action, Dr. Tabatabaei?
Personally, I don't know. I do not think I should cause harm if someone is causing harm on my side. And it's very interesting because I was in Iran like 2 months ago, just for the holiday. We went there and we almost got stranded with all the things happened during that time. We were with the kids skiing one day in beautiful mountains of Alborz, and next day there was like the General Soleimani's assassination and the missile attacks and everything. But even in the midst of everything, when you talk to just ordinary Iranians, they don't have that anger, that hatred, that when I talk to some ordinary American friends they have against Iran, and they don't understand it. And I tell them, I remind them, well, this is because of hostage taking. They said, I wasn't born during hostage taking. What are you talking about? And I don't know when it's going to be over, but somehow, as Jamal said, for a period of time, talking about Iran, a country of 80 million, is as if you're talking about one person, and that person is a bad person. And everything was black and white, and talking about Iran was very radioactive. I think that's changing gradually. I think people are getting a little more knowledgeable about the subject. But I don't think the answer to this, I think the answer is more education of our friends, and just let them make the change. Let them push their representative to make the change. I think this tit for tat is not going to help the world that much. That's my personal view.
Thank you, Doctor. This next one is for you, Jamal. This is from Mike Van Elzacker, who also contributed to this webinar. was partly his idea to hold this series on sanctions. And his question is how best to counter the argument that Pompeo offered humanitarian aid and that the Iranian government refused it, and therefore there's no reason to lift sanctions for humanitarian reasons. How best to counter that argument?
First of all, I don't think the U.S. is in a position to be providing humanitarian aid. We have our own problems that we're not handling very well. I think that was an insincere, a very insincere offer. I think, again, if we care about the Iranian people, if we care about people in general, we should not be abetting their government in hurting them. We shouldn't, excuses for bad policies on our side of the equation should not just be, well, the other government's bad, so we're going to do the same thing. But as far as this specific case, I mean, there was, the government turned away Doctors Without Borders yesterday or the day before, and then worked it out, and now they've brought them back. They figured that issue out. I really think that the issue here is not that Iran is looking for a handout from the United States, but that Iran needs its own infrastructure to be able to respond to this crisis. So we're not talking about whatever Mike Pompeo was going to send to Iran. This is a giant systemic problem. Iran needs to have an infrastructure to be able to deal with it in a complete way, not in a piecemeal token humanitarian gifts way. And then I also think just that, if you look at the responses from people like Pompeo, he's still not talking about this as a humanitarian crisis or a human tragedy or a pandemic that needs to be dealt with. He still funnels all of his talking points into this political ideology. It's the Wuhan virus. If Iran wants us to do anything, they have to come to us on bended knee and ask for it. This is not the time for those ideological squabbles. This is a crisis we're dealing with now. The U.S. can, with a stroke of a pen, suspend these sanctions. They can do it right now if they want to, and they're not doing it. And Pompeo making an insincere offer that would not solve the problem for Iran does not absolve this government of the humanitarian punishment it continues to impose on Iranians.
Thank you. This next question is for you, Dr. Tabatabaei. It's from Amin. It says the Trump administration claims that emergency medical help is not sanctioned. Is that practically true? Can Iran purchase drugs and medical equipment easily?
As I mentioned, it is technically true, meaning you can, as an Iranian hospital, you can actually go and put your money and buy this CT scan. But there are a few problems. There is no bank, so you can't actually make any transactions. There is no credit. There's no international credit. There is no insurance. There's no way to deliver that device to the country because almost all the shipping industry, everything is under sanction. And because of travel ban, there will be no technician to come and help to install the machine. So although, yes, it's like, the way I treat my, I used to treat my, kids. So, well, this ice cream is yours, but if you could get it. And the ice cream is on the other side of the window and you can't get it. So I think it's more to alleviate the concerns of, citizens to say, hey, we are not really we're not bad. We are actually just sanctioning the government. You see, we are not sanctioning the humanitarian aids. And all my friends, when I talk to them here, they all say the same thing. So, well, humanitarian aids are not unsanctioned. But it's a very smart way of really inflicting a mass suffering without really taking responsibility for it.
Thanks. This next question is for Jamal. And let's see. Sorry, I lost the thread there for a second, but I remember it well enough. And I have seen this in the media narrative, saying that it is now Iran that's abandoning the deal and returning to its enrichment program, when it was in fact the United States, of course, that dropped out of the deal, and all the rest of the countries remained in. What's the best way to challenge this false narrative?
Iran continues to maintain that if the United States returns to its commitments, all of the activities that they have put in place in response to the U.S. breaching the deal will be rolled back. And there's been no sign that is not the case. These measures actually, Iran waited a full year and did nothing. Continued to keep its nuclear program under certain limits. All of the there are 11, maybe more now, 12, 13 IAEA reports on how Iran was upholding its commitments under the deal, and doing so in the midst of maximum pressure sanctions, getting not even 10% of what was promised as a condition for those nuclear commitments. After 12 months, Iran began taking gradual steps with fanfare. I mean, not sneaking around and doing things, but announcing every 60 days, every 90 days, we're going to take a new step, and this is explicitly aimed at putting pressure on the United States. If the United States returns to its commitments, we will do the same. So anybody who's concerned about Iran restarting centrifuges or any of the other nuclear actions, there's a very easy way to end those activities, and that's to go back to our commitments under the nuclear deal. It's a completely self-created crisis. And this is also part of the problem, because I think that there's not a good face-saving way for Trump out of this conundrum, where he could just drop the sanctions and go back to the status quo. I thought maybe that this coronavirus crisis would be such an opportunity. Rob Malley and Ali Vaez of International Crisis Group wrote about this, I think, a week ago. And clearly, at least with Pompeo calling the shots, Trump is not taking the opportunity to walk back, abandoning the deal.
But if I may, I think to just support this idea, I think this is the best time to pressure the administration, because this is the fantastic face-saving opportunity for the administration to do the right thing and become a champion, and without really, changing the previous narrative and previous, objectives.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions from two activists who are actually working on this, and this is for you, Dr. Tabatabaei. From Simon Elliott, what is the structure of the Iranian healthcare system? Is it single payer? Is it a mix of public and private insurance? And how has this affected their ability to respond? And also from Neha Deshpande, who is organizing an anti-sanctions campaign right here in Eastern Massachusetts with Boston DSA. Prior to COVID-19, how were goods and medical supplies able to get into Iran, and how are they able to get in now?
So to answer the first question about the system, the healthcare system, the country has something very similar to the kind of social security, the kind of universal health care system that we have here. So particularly with President Rouhani's first term, he made it as a law that every Iranian citizen has a right, they should have a complete, healthcare services. And that worked out very well. On top of it, if you don't want to wait in line, you can actually benefit from a private insurance services. So both of them are working very similar to Germany, I would say. You have the combination of both. But because of sanctions, the national health system is almost collapsing because they were not able to afford it anymore. So there's significant debt on the national health system. Many physicians in public hospitals are not being paid for like more than 18 months. And I'm not exaggerating, like 18 months of no pay, but they're still working. So things are getting very bad, but still they try to maintain the two systems. In terms of medical supply, as I mentioned, the system was unsustainable before coronavirus. People were able to manage things. Now, if you can't have the, staples, you start stitching the old-fashioned. You use more equipment with a less quality, but still works out. But now with the pressure of coronavirus, things are unbearable, and it may collapse actually. And many physicians are worried about that. Here in Massachusetts, we're worried about it with amazing hospitals that we have. Imagine a country with so much pressure, so much international economic hardship. It's extremely difficult to tolerate the effect of coronavirus on top of the sanctions.
Thank you, Doctor. I'll just ask one more question of Jamal, and then I know Cole wants to wrap up with a call to action. A couple of questions from Holly Lapp, who's an activist with FCNL. Does the spread of COVID-19 in Iran put U.S. military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan at risk? And also from John Ratliff, how has China been able to direct extensive aid to Iran? Now, are they directing aid now that they have seemed to solve the problem, or on their way to solving the problem in China?
China is providing aid. How exactly they're providing it, I'm not sure of the details. I imagine it's goods, and China and Iran, maintain strong economic ties. And China has ways, that they have devised to get around U.S. sanctions. China is one of the few countries that is actually, continues to buy Iranian oil and has defied U.S. sanctions. It's actually, the spread of corona in Iran is at least to some degree attributable to those close ties and to Iran's reliance on China. Iran actually didn't cut off flights between flights with China when a lot of people thought they should have, likely because of the reliance on China for the economy because of these sanctions. So China is stepping up and providing relief. And then as far as U.S. troops, I imagine eventually that would be a concern. I actually am not sure what the U.S. is doing to keep troops out of harm's way from coronavirus. But I do think that this situation, it's just this enormous, it's a metaphor for what we are already looking at with our Iran policy. Our Iran policy does put U.S. troops in harm's way. We've seen this. We've seen, in January, we thought that 2020 couldn't get any worse. Dozens, something like 60 or 70 U.S. troops had traumatic brain injury from the Iranian missiles that were launched at the bases inside of Iraq. You see the continued, proxies inside of Iraq attacking U.S. bases and things like that. So these are the repercussions of a maximum pressure policy and of our Iran policy. With Corona, we're seeing the same thing, where it is now having these iterations beyond Iran's borders. And while I don't know if, there is an immediate risk to U.S. personnel in the region, I certainly think that if this is not contained, there's a risk to everybody in the region and the entire world, obviously. So I don't think it's a smoking gun talking point or anything like that, but you know, I think that you can't deny that this is a global problem. This is all linked. So if it hurts Iranians, it's eventually going to hurt us.
Thank you, and I want to thank everyone for asking your questions. They were great questions, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to yours. I would like to turn it back over to Cole at this point.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Shahin and Jamal, for your excellent presentations and excellent answers. There's really a lot to do here, but we really have an opportunity to move the debate here as everyone understands that the COVID crisis is sweeping the country and the world, and that we're all in this together. And we have an opportunity to frame this as a purely humanitarian issue. So it's, you know, more than just an international relations issue, more than just a peace issue. It's just a human issue. It's a medical issue. And so can people get behind that? Just in terms of reminder for our calls to action, I have just been pasting them in the chat. There's the 80 hours to 80 million lives. That is the one to contact the Treasury directly, sponsored by Empower Change. And then there's a action page to send a message to Congress to sign on to the letter that it was initiated by AOC, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and others. I think there were 28 signers in Congress or something the last I knew, and need to get more. And third is the congressional letter itself, if you'd like to read the details of what has been sent out about that. I also want to remind you that we have 3 more webinars in our series, and my fat fingers have not found the link to those other webinars. Brian, could you find that and paste that in the chat? But suffice it to say, we have for the next 3 Thursdays.
And we did just have a good question from Selena, who asks if there's a link that we can share.
Right. Yeah, we will post this webinar. The Facebook Live did not work. We will post it on YouTube either later tonight or tomorrow morning. And I will send a follow-up email to those who registered or those who came on the chat, whatever emails Zoom gives me, to point you to that information. So Brian, could you paste into the chat the link to the future webinars? That's the last thing I want to bring to people's attention.
Absolutely. I will paste that right now for the next 3. Thanks for taking that. I was trying to, but I was on mute. So I'll paste that right now.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. We appreciate your participation. Please give us your feedback. This is Mass Peace Action's first webinar ever. And so we are learning as we go, and we appreciate your feedback on how best to organize online. Since we cannot leave our houses to protest and gather, we have to do it this way. So we're learning as we go. So thank you for your feedback. Good night.
Good night.